Today, Great.com talks to Cameron Cote, who is Western Outreach Director at Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. If you haven't heard of them, they are a non-profit organisation on a mission to save lives. If you are new here, please press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we learn the reason for an abortion-free Canada. Hello, Cameron, and welcome to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. It's a joy to be on, and thank you to everyone tuning in. It's great to be able to connect on a really important issue in today's society.
No, thank you so much for being here, and I'm really interested to learn more about what an abortion-free Canada looks like, and sort of some of the reasons for why that should be. So to start with, Cameron, for me and anybody new here, what is CCBR and what do you do?
Absolutely. So we are a national educational pro-life organization. We see the pro-life movement as having three kind of distinct but collaborative arms. You've got your pastoral groups that are working with moms and dads to help navigate the challenging pregnancies they're faced with. Maybe if financial struggles are a problem, maybe if relationship troubles, they're the counselors to work one-on-one. And then you got the political arm of the pro-life movement, which works to advance legislation. But we're the educational arm, and we work proactively to change minds and save lives on the issue, talking to people on street corners and on doorsteps and helping them understand that all humans should get human rights and that human rights must begin when a human's life biologically begins. And so we try to educate people in senior high school, at universities, college campuses, and busy downtown corridors so that they realize that abortion is age-based discrimination and that it's a human rights violation that demands a better solution. The mothers and fathers are faced with crazy situations day after day, but we don't solve problems by killing innocent humans. And so that's our job. That's what we do day after day. We are out there in many ways. We're the people on the front lines who are trying to direct people towards the pregnancy care centers, trying to connect them with the resources that will actually help them through their pregnancy and not kill their weak and innocent child at whatever stage of development they're at.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron, for sharing that with us. And I mean, for me, this, to me, in all honesty, is completely new. And I'm sure we got some viewers or listeners that are going to listen to this, and it's going to be new to them as well. And you use the word there, which is kill, which is a very strong word, obviously. And you mentioned about, say, a human life begins when it's obviously being born biologically. So could you sort of talk to us a little bit more about that side of it, if it's okay, please? Like when a human life starts, etc.
Absolutely. And that's where we think the whole conversation comes down to, right? Because if abortion does not kill an innocent human, then no justification for abortion is necessary, right? It's just like having your appendix removed or your haircut. But if abortion does kill an innocent human being, then we need to do everything we can to prevent it from happening. And so what we go to is the science. You can look up any legitimate science textbook used in a high school, university, college setting. You can Google, when does human life begin? And you're going to find that human life begins at fertilization. And we know that from a couple of different ways, but very simply, if something is growing, even from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells, it must be alive. Living thing or dead things don't grow. And so if you've got a growing entity, even from fertilization, you've got a living organism. And if that living organism has human parents, he or she must be a living human. And so abortion, which directly and intentionally ends the life of that innocent human, must be considered to be a human rights violation. And we obviously understand there's, again, so many hard situations. We're not trying to call mothers and fathers who are contemplating or maybe have already chosen abortion terrible people. We're not here to stand on some soapbox and condemn people. We want to help people. We want to help people who are in bad situations. We want to help people who have gone through bad situations to find the hope, the healing, and the support they need to continue navigating life well without killing preborn children, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me, definitely. So I want to ask you then, why is what you guys do so important?
It's a great question. And in many ways, it's because not only of the severity of what's going on, but the magnitude as well. when we think about injustice, we often understand that injustice becomes more severe when it's targeted towards weaker and more vulnerable people. Attacks against women and children, attacks against people who may have disabilities, attacks against people who can't defend themselves are often met with outrage. Who is weaker and more vulnerable than a preborn child who can neither run from their abortion provider, nor can they hide, nor can they fight back? They are completely defenseless in every way. And with that, in Canada, there are around 100,000 abortions every year. Abortion is legal through all 9 months of pregnancy in Canada. And while the majority of them happen in the first trimester, we have to ask, how is that any better than later on in pregnancy? I mean, globally, we're looking at 50 million abortions every year. And I think we simply need to challenge ourselves with, how would we be responding if that was 50 million 2-year-olds being killed every year in the name of choice? Certainly, we try to educate people on how this is not an appropriate choice. Even when you're faced with terrible situations, we don't solve that by killing humans. And so I think that it demands more attention, not because they are making eloquent arguments and are contributing to society, but rather because human value is not based on what we contribute to society. We don't get human rights based on how much we offer economically or socially towards the world. We get human rights based on the fact that we're humans. And so if all humans should get human rights, and these are the weakest, most vulnerable humans of the human family, I think we need to be thinking about how we can better support mothers and fathers so that they are no longer victims.
Yeah, Cameron, well, thank you again for sharing that with us. And you mentioned there about what is the difference between, say, an unborn baby and a 2-year-old, right? Because there would be, say, uproar if people went out and, say, let's say, murdered a bunch of 2-year-olds. It would be horrendous. But there's obviously an argument for what you guys are for, which is, say, not to, say, have an abortion of an unborn child. You mentioned as well, through Canada, I believe you said it was legal to have an abortion throughout the whole nine months of pregnancy.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So I want to ask you then, say, what are some of, say, the main reasons for abortion? Like, is it financial struggles, maybe lack of education or contraception, etc.?
I think there's a lot of things that go into it. And for a lot of mothers, they're not required to report why they're choosing abortion, but it's different for everyone. I've spoken to literally thousands of people who have had abortions. And for many of them, it's like what you mentioned. It's financial difficulties. It's while they're in university or even in high school, it's being in a difficult relationship and not wanting to have to marry and live with that guy for the rest of their lives. A lot of really legitimate problems, right? A lot of really legitimate concerns that these mothers are faced with. And yet I think that that's what we come back to, that we all agree that there are challenging situations. We all agree that they demand responses, right? I mean, oftentimes people talk about victims of sexual assault. And I've personally spoken to hundreds of people who have been victimized through sexual assault. And my heart goes out to them as something I can never fully comprehend and fathom. And yet I've also met people who have lived in abusive relationships and they've got born children. I talked to a woman in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, who had 2 kids, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and the abuse didn't begin until after both her kids were born. Her husband had lost his job, became an alcoholic, and started abusing her and the kids. Thankfully, by that point, she had been separated from that husband. He was going through courts and hopefully ending up in prison. But now when she looked at her 2-year-old and 4-year-old, she was no longer reminded of a happy, loving relationship. She no longer thought of them in loving ways in which they reminded her of joy and happiness. They reminded her of an abusive relationship. And yet we'd never solved that problem. We'd never removed the reminder of that trauma by killing the 2-year-old and 4-year-old. And so there's a ton of very, very real situations that pro-lifers and ultimately all of society need to help address. And they're not easy, right? You don't fix these problems by throwing money at them any more than you fix them by providing abortions. These challenges, these problems demand emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual support, helping mothers navigate parenthood because parenthood is overwhelming. Parenthood is difficult. I got a 2-year-old kid. I've got another one on the way. I will be the first to admit that parenting is incredibly challenging. That's why we need better support, not greater access to abortion.
What sort of really stood out for me there, Cameron, was how, if I think about it, every single, say, situation is all unique. Like, no one, say, mother's situation will be the same as another's. For instance, you mentioned like sexual abuse, etc. Like, so for me, like, I like to ask the question then. Say, for instance, if a mother's a reason for wanting an abortion was due to, say, being raped, etc., like it's horrendous.
Yeah.
Like, how would you say even go about, say, not dealing, but like trying to help that
Yeah.
situation, and how would you maybe support that individual that has really been affected as well?
Absolutely. And I think that in many ways, this support needs to be led by the victim, right? I feel like so often in society, we encounter somebody like this, we try to have a textbook response of, you know what, you've been violated in this way and you are this old and we're going to solve that problem in this way. I think that it needs to be victim led, but I think that the solutions all need to be life affirming without killing an innocent human. And so I mentioned earlier that mother up in Edmonton who had the born kids, and she was able to access very high quality counseling and therapy to help her navigate the trauma of her experience. And during that time, her children were placed in a temporary adoptive home, a responsible adoptive family that had been filtered and trained to manage children who have been raised in abusive homes. And that was a temporary situation at the time to ensure that she was able to access the help that she needed to process the abuse that she had gone through without needing to put food on the table for her children, without needing to think about rent or other kind of complications in her life, but also knowing that as she was able to start managing the trauma that she had gone through in a sustainable way, that she'd be reconnected with those kids, she'd be able to continue caring and loving them. And I think that solution really worked for her based on where she was at in life. And I think the same thing goes with victims of sexual assault who become pregnant, that we need to tailor the support towards their needs. Where are they at? What do they need? Are they in college? Are they working? Do they have other children? Are they married? Are they not? All of these different factors will influence the way that we address helping her move forward. However, with that, we're not going to kill an innocent human. If at the end of 9 months she's not in the place to care for that child, then connecting that mother with a responsible adoptive home, whether an open adoption where she's allowed to visit that child whenever she wants to, or whether a closed adoption where that child is placed in a family that has been vetted and ensured that they're going to be safe and supportive, and that mother is able to resume, whether it's her studies, whether it's her employment, with the confidence that that child is looked after and cared for in a safe setting. And so I think that it does really depend on the personal situations, but just like how every situation is different with born children, and yet in all of those situations, it's wrong to kill the born child. The same thing goes for pregnancy, that it's different for every single pregnant mother. And yet the principle can remain that we don't solve whatever problem she may be dealt with by killing that innocent human.
So I'd like to ask then now about, you mentioned, say, potentially a mother that's given birth to a child that maybe she's not ready to deal with the pressures of, say, being a mother, whether that's financially, mentally, physically. And you mentioned, say, adoption, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So are you guys, say, in partnership with, say, an adoption, is it a centre? I'm not too sure what the right name is for it, but are you in partnership with anyone to, say, help that process be, say, more smoother?
Mm-hmm. So, as I mentioned off the top, we think of the educational arm working together with that pastoral arm, the arm that's working with the moms and dads in whatever situation they're in. And so whenever we encounter somebody on a street corner, on a doorstep, who's in that situation, then we're going to connect them with good friends of ours who are working in that professional counseling capacity. A great group that works actually internationally, two of them actually. One of them is called Choice choice42, choice number 4, number 2.com, works to support moms, dads, families in whatever they're going through. Same thing with Birthright. Birthright is an international organization that works to support moms and dads, and they work with not only private but also public entities that are going to help navigate a lot of the challenges, whether it's housing, whether it's food and diapers, whether it's family support and having a mentor couple to help you navigate the emotional, psychological challenges of caring for a child. They're going to offer holistic support in whatever that looks like, through private entities like churches and pro-life organizations, through public entities like government programs and services, and through individual support through people that might be in a good spot to help mentor and care for those mothers and fathers. And so we are thrilled to be able to connect people in those ways so often. And as I mentioned, we often meet them even before they become pregnant. And so when we come into a town, sometimes we'll see a spike in the number of people accessing the local pregnancy care center, because people have already made up their mind that abortion is not an appropriate solution before they even become pregnant. They become pregnant a year or two later, and they realize, you know what, I'm in a bad spot, but I know that there's help available. I know there's support available. So they're going to go that route.
And also, just come to mind as well a moment ago, Cameron, I know we mentioned, say, victims of rape, etc. But what do you do in a situation where, say, for instance, a mother's got pregnant and, say, a nurse or a doctor almost diagnose that unborn baby with, say, a severe, something like being disabled, etc.? Like, how would you go about that?
I can definitely empathize with the situation, right? It's heart-wrenching for any parent, whether it's a parent who wanted to have that baby or whether that's a parent who was surprised by the pregnancy announcement. That's going to be overwhelming, because that changes a lot of what you're going to be looking at through the rest of that child's life. Maybe there's tremendous pain and suffering down the road for that child. And the way that we try to think about that and process it is simply, what would we do if we didn't find out until after the child was born? Right? There's lots of tragic and terrible conditions in which you can't know about them until after the child is born. You think of multiple sclerosis or Huntington's disease or any form of cancer. So many of these only manifest after the child is born. When faced with great sorrow, are we going to meet that with love, compassion, and empathy? Or are we going to meet that by saying we're going to alleviate the suffering by eliminating the sufferer? We don't go through hospital wards and look at people who are in intense pain and suffering and start killing them, right? We try to offer the best care that we possibly can for those people and try to make their lives as beautiful and as easy to endure as possible. We try to alleviate the suffering, not eliminate the sufferer. And I think that's vital for us to recognize that especially as so many in the developing world, I know this is a different can of worms, but as we look at how we respond to suffering for people with disabilities, people towards the end of their life, what statement are we saying if we say that their life is no longer worth living? Who are we to say, first of all, and who are we to suggest that pain and suffering is too much for that child? Both you and I have gone through tremendous suffering. I had the beautiful opportunity to read through a lot of your testimony, Ryan, and listen to several of your podcasts. And you have such a beautiful witness on that. And that your life isn't, when you're in that crazy hospital situation, this wasn't a calculus of how much is he going to suffer or not suffer. This is a matter of, this is a beautiful human being who deserves human rights regardless of whether they're going to suffer profoundly or not. Our lives and our values not defined by our suffering, not defined by what we may or may not be able to contribute to society. Our lives are defined by the fact that we are living humans and that all living humans get human rights.
Wow, Cameron, that's such a valuable point of view as well for anybody that sort of maybe was thinking slightly different. It's a great way of explaining it too. So thank you. So I want to maybe take a step back briefly, because I know we'll be wrapping up shortly, but you mentioned, I believe, earlier that it's about 100,000, I believe you say, abortions in Canada each year, if I'm correct in saying that. So what effects do you think that would have on the economy in Canada? Say if the population was to increase every year by, say, 100,000 people? And what effects would that have over, say, a 10-year period? Like, would there be enough, say, infrastructure and resources and space for people to live if that was the case?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and a little bit tongue in cheek. There's lots of room in Canada. For anyone who's been to Canada, there is a lot of room for people in Canada, just for the record. And so if you're in a country where it might be a little bit more densely populated, we got lots of room over here. But that's in jest. I would say that in many ways there is infrastructure. There are tremendous numbers of people who are willing and able to adopt children. There's a tremendous number of people who are compassionate foster homes, even though tragically we read about the very few bad apples, as it were, in the news, tragically. I think that there is a lot of infrastructure in place right now. I think that there's capacity for a tremendous amount more infrastructure. But I also think that as people change their perspectives on the abortion issue, it changes their behavior, right? That once you realize that you don't have abortion as a backup plan, you don't have abortion as a plan B, as it were, then it's going to impact the choices and decisions you make in life. The sexual encounters that you have with different people, and when you engage in that, and how you engage in that, and all that sort of thing. And I think that as people change their perspective more and more on the abortion issue, then certainly there are going to be more people who are accessing adoptive services. But I'm sure that there's going to be many people who decide that they're going to behave differently, I suppose. And that isn't to be super prudish and going back to some crazy archaic time. This is a matter of being responsible with actions and being more intentional about our actions, having better education, better awareness, even on like we've talked about on the case of sexual assault. Once we realize that we can't solve that problem by killing the child, then we're going to have better safe walk programs. We're going to have firmer punishment for perpetrators of that injustice. We're going to ensure that there's better support available and better education, so that doesn't happen in the first place. And so I think there's a lot of things that will go into what a transformed culture looks like, even before we start talking about legislation. But it is a great question in how not only the pro-life movement, but society as a whole is going to respond to this, right? We've gone through this before, whether it's other injustices, whether we look at slavery, whether we look at gender-based discrimination and not giving the vote to women, whether it's other forms of discrimination. It has demanded some degree of social change. You think about what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation in America, freeing hundreds of thousands of slaves. There was a lot of socioeconomic concerns and questions that came out of that. And yet it would have been wildly inappropriate to say, okay, well, we're gonna let slavery happen for a couple more years while we work out these socioeconomic components of what are we going to do with all of these freed slaves. No, we recognize that there's an injustice. We end the injustice. And thankfully, we've been blessed in society with brilliant economic and social minds to help navigate and ease whatever challenges might come up socioeconomically. I think the same thing goes for abortion. Right? That as we get better information, better education out there, then the creative shakers and movers of the world are going to continue to allow society to flourish in different ways without this massive population being killed. When you think that in Canada, around 1 in 4, 1 in 5 pregnancies end in abortion, that's going to radically change our population. However, that is going to be met with creative, innovative ways of navigating social problems. And it's going to require that.
Wow, Cameron, thank you again for sharing that with us. Very in-depth as well. So sort of as we wrap this up now, Cameron, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the greatest needs of the individuals that you support, and how are you a part of the solution?
Yeah, and so we're a huge part of the educational solution and kind of the middleman solution as well, connecting them with the support that's available. In Canada, I'm sure in the UK as well, there's an amazing network of pregnancy care centers that go almost unheard of amongst the population, right? Maybe they've got the odd bus ad that you see it on the side of public transit or something like that, but a lot of people are not aware of the support that's available for them. And so that's a lot of the education that we provide and awareness that we provide for people, and then connecting them with that support. And I know that different pregnancy care centers are going to have different levels of ability, And maybe that means that your local pregnancy care center could really use some more financial support, or maybe they could use you volunteering on a weekly or a monthly basis as a part-time receptionist, or as somebody who can organize and distribute clothing and vitamins, or something like that. Maybe you're somebody who is a fantastic parent yourself, and you can pass on some of your wisdom towards somebody who's overwhelmed by the prospect of being a young mom or young dad. And so there's a lot of support that is already available and that we want to connect people with. There's a lot of support that still needs to be provided that maybe some of the listeners can help and prayerfully consider whether they can get connected with their local group. But at the end of the day, education is so vital, because hundreds of mothers and fathers that I've spoken to, when they realize that abortion does actually kill an innocent human being, they say, why didn't I know? Why was I told by so many people in society that it's just a clump of cells, or that it's just pregnancy tissue, or that it's just a fetus? Why didn't they tell me that it was actually a human being? And that education, or lack thereof, has resulted in thousands and thousands of people killing children without knowing that they were killing children. The culpability for this action is so low because the information is so difficult for them to come to. We need more people who compassionately engage people in their spheres of influence. That the abortion conversation can be incredibly polarizing, and that doesn't serve anyone, especially not the mothers and fathers in hard situations. They don't need people yelling and screaming. They need people connecting with them on a meaningful level. And I actually co-host a podcast called the Pro-Life Guys Podcast, prolifeguys.com, where we offer guidance for how to have productive conversations that are compassionate but still compelling, that aren't a matter of I will support you regardless of what you choose, even if that includes killing a child, but rather I will support you in the best way possible, and I'll help you in whatever way you need. And so a lot of that info, like I said, is available, prolifeguys.com. You can find us on your favorite podcast catcher or on YouTube. And I think that so much of this, like I said, as a couple times already, starts with the education and then flows into the other solutions throughout society.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's super important to say put the parents' best interest first as well, you know, because it is to do with those two individuals, and then say the unborn child too. So yeah, it's super important to support them and give them the correct information rather than any information, you know. So yeah, like as we're going to wrap up now, Cameron, I'd like to know then, say, if anybody's listening to this and wants to support you or reach out at all or get involved, like, what's the best way that they can do that, and what action steps can they take to be a part of the solution?
Absolutely. So I would say hit us up at prolifeguys.com. You can find us on all your favorite social media handles as well, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Pro-Life Guys or Pro-Life Guys Podcast, whatever it is on those. You can send us an email. You can message us on social media. And regardless of where you're tuning in from, if it's the UK, if it's mainland Europe, if it's North America, wherever it may be, we can probably connect you with a local group that is doing educational work and or a pastoral group that's supporting pregnant moms. And so that's so important, getting informed in what is actually going on and how you can actually make a difference. And no contribution is too small. If you say, you know, I don't have thousands of dollars to donate, but I might have $10, or I can't do this full time like you do, Cam, but maybe you can volunteer once a month or once a week or something like that. That goes so far into impacting the lives around you. And so hit us up at prolifeguys.com or on your favorite podcast catcher, whatever it may be, YouTube as well. Get connected, get trained, and learn how you can make a greater impact in the world to help, like you said, Ryan, mothers and fathers, as well as those children, to live life well in a way that affirms all of those three lives and not just a couple of them.
Cameron, thank you so much for today. And for you listening, if you've enjoyed this episode, please press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that will show the algorithm that this is an important conversation, so more people can learn about the reasons for stopping abortion.